Okay, you should have your notes out. We're going to be doing some calculating today. We're going to be using distance formula, midpoint formula, and Pythagorean theorem. Should be some formulas that you saw in Algebra 1. We'll be using them a lot in geometry, so we want to make sure that we have practice with that. Okay. Just about warmed up, I think. Okay, so our objectives for today are that we're going to go through formulas for the midpoint, distance, and Pythagorean theorem. All right, a little bit of terminology, should be some things from algebra still. Okay, from algebra, we had the coordinate plane, which is basically your xy axis, right? Divided with the horizontal being which axis? That's your x-axis, and then the y-axis is the vertical one. Okay? Remember, your ordered pairs are always an x and a y. So a little review of some algebra things. We're going to try and find the midpoint of a segment on a number line and then on a coordinate plane. We did the number line ideas in our maybe first, second lesson, something like that. We probably had a segment. Remember the problems where it said like C is between A and B, or actually maybe I better do midpoint. C is the midpoint of A and B. What did midpoint mean? Okay, the very middle of it, it bisects it into what? Two congruent segments, okay? So get all the details on that definition. Two congruent segments. So we did things like if A was at 5 and B is at 27, we can figure out what that was. Remember our picnic problem with the road signs? We did that type of thing. So what's halfway between those? Well, one way we did it was figured out how far that was, 22. We want 11 here and 11 here. So we could come up with 16. There's another way that you can calculate that. You can use just the coordinates. You can use the coordinate of 5 and the coordinate of 7, or 27. And how do you find a number that's exactly halfway in the middle of two others? And thinking about it in terms of what you're used to, you had a test that was a 70 and a test that was a 90. If those are your only grades, what's your average? What's the grade that's exactly in the middle? 80. How do you figure that? Add up, and in that case, divide by 2. So you can average the coordinates to figure out what the coordinate is here. The coordinate of 5 and 27, if you add those, that's 32. Divided by 2 is 16. So the point of my example here is you can find the point, the coordinate of the point that's in the middle by averaging, adding together and dividing by 2. And when we're on an xy axis, we have x's and y's. So in your notes, you'll see description of, I think, the formula. I don't think I would make this whole picture. I think I would wait for an example. But what's going on here is to find the point M, to find its coordinates, we need to average. Since the coordinates of M have both an x and a y to it, we have to average each one of them. So what they're showing you is if A and B are your endpoints, on the x-axis, if we average the x's, we find the x of the midpoint. Okay? And on the y-axis, if we average the y values, we'll find the y for the midpoint. So as a result, our formula for finding a midpoint coordinates, we average the x's, we add the two x's and divide by 2, we add the two y's and divide by 2. Finding the coordinates of the midpoint. Well, let's try that on this example. Okay, so find the coordinates of the midpoint of segment PQ. The endpoint P is -8,3 and Q is -2,7. Let's try the calculation and then we'll check it on the graph to make sure it worked out right. So your -8,3, those are an x and a y. Let's say those are from the first point. So I'm going to call that x1, y1. And then on the q, Those again are an x and a y, will go sub 2 because they're the x and the y from the second point. Okay, so look at that formula. Add the x values and divide by 2. Add the y's and divide by 2. No, it's a comma. Because it's number, comma, number. If that point makes sense. So either graph paper or your marker board graph. Let's graph the 2 points that I gave you, P and Q, and connect those with a segment. Your iPads can be flipped over and even put out of the way. Okay, so graph the 2 points I started you with. That makes a segment. And now see if the point that you think is the midpoint, you got its coordinates, graph it, and see, is it on that segment? And does it appear to be at the halfway point? Sometimes you can catch mistakes by taking a look at it on the graph. The midpoint should have been negative 5, 5. Question on that first example. Okay, let's try another one. Hey, I want point E to be negative 2, 3, and point F as 5, negative 3. Let's have you calculate first and then check on the graph. So you might be thinking, oh, graphing, that'll work easier. Not only if it comes out to be whole numbers, and once I throw some fractions or decimals, your graphing method really doesn't work very well. You can check with it. Put the cover, the lid on the marker as much as possible. Check out okay? Is that the right graph? I don't think that graph's right. Negative 2.
Oh, no, I didn't.
One of them had a negative. Okay, answers on that? I think it was 1.5, 0. You're adding the x's. You're adding -2 and 5, and then dividing by 2. That's 1.5. Okay, and when you add 3 and -3, that's 0. Divided by 2 is still 0. Okay, how many got that right? Let's see everybody's. We got quite a few, but not everyone yet. Questions? Any certain question? Okay. This one's a little bit different. Now read through carefully and tell me what's different. Okay, so you're doing what this time? You're finding D. What's different about D?
That's on the endpoint. Is it a did?
Okay, D is not the midpoint. D is one of the endpoints, okay? So let's try this one graphing first of all, so you can take a look at it. So M is going to be the midpoint of a segment ED. Okay, E is 2, 7. Label that E, so you know which one it is. Okay, and then M is 6, 1. That's M. Now M is supposed to be the midpoint of a segment. So ME, you could draw that one in, ME. But then M needs to go the other direction also, the same amount. Can you visually figure out where the other end would have to be? So that M is the midpoint. Do some counting. How far does it need to go for M to be the midpoint? M is half of it. You need to go further here so that M is out of the halfway point. It would have to be midpoint. Write down what you think point B is. Now I'm going to have you check your answer. Okay? So you have point E up here. You have D that you're making the guess at. Use E and D. Calculate what the midpoint is. Use point E and D and find what the midpoint is. We're going to see if it comes out with M's coordinates or not. So average your point E and point D. I don't want to say what D is because some of you have different answers. You did -2, so it's supposed to be +2. You're checking your point D along with E to see if it calculates to give you the midpoint. Not quite. The light bulb is off. It's 7 and you have 7 plus -5 divided by 2. Oh, okay. Not having a ruler probably makes this a little hard to. Okay, what's D end up being? Should be 10, -5. Now, here's a way that you can calculate it instead, okay? Especially if that didn't come out right. We can use the midpoint formula to figure out what the point is instead of graphing, okay? so I'll put some notes up there. All right, let me show you or talk you through that. Okay, what we're doing on the screen there is we're saying, was it D we didn't know? D was XY, E was -27, and the midpoint was, remember the problem? 27. E was 27, M was 6.1. Is that right? Okay. So we're trying to find the missing endpoint. These two together are supposed to give me the midpoint. So if I just think about the formula, if I would take x plus 2 and divide by 2, what am I supposed to get? What should I get when I average the x's of the endpoint? Wasn't I supposed to get the 6 of the midpoint? Averaging the endpoints gives us the midpoint. Averaging the y's is supposed to give me the y of the midpoint. If I would solve these, multiply by 2 to get rid of the fraction, add, subtract 2, x equals 6. Are we giving the right numbers? I shouldn't have done my screen so fast. And what's the answer come out to be? Okay, I'm doing something. Oh, I can't multiply. Bad day today. Okay, 6 times 2 is 12. Mine's 2, 10. Okay, I thought it was supposed to come out to be 10. My bad. Okay, multiply this one by 2 to solve it. Y plus 7 equals 2. Subtract 7, and you get y to be -5. So by calculating, I can come up with D being 10, -5, and not graph it at all. Think about what I just did. This was one endpoint, this is the other endpoint. So I'm averaging those together to come up with the coordinates of the midpoint. We're going to try that method and not graph it. Okay, so next question here. S is the midpoint of RT. Okay, so put midpoint, S. That's -6, -1. Or R is -6, -1. S is -1, +1. So R is one endpoint. I think I'll even just do that. Endpoints. R is one endpoint. What's the other endpoint? T. What are the coordinates of T? X, Y. Okay, then the midpoint is S. That has coordinates -1, 1. So you're going to average the endpoints to get the coordinates of the midpoint. See if you can set it up with the coordinates. Average the x's of the endpoints to get the x of the midpoint. Average the y's of the endpoints to get the y of the midpoint. So, 2 problems. Multiply by 2 on each side, we get rid of the fraction. is when you're solving, you multiply it side by 2, that will turn into a 2. Making sense out of it? You average the negative 6 and the x, you should get the negative 1. Or they have a 12 because that was a different problem. Set it equal to 6 to start with, 6 was the x. Okay, looks like answer comes out 4-3. Okay, question on how I set it up. Page, yes? Okay, do you understand these are the endpoints? R and T are the endpoints? Okay, and that midpoint formula that you have in your notes says to get the midpoint, you need to average the x's and average the y's, add together and divide by 2. So what I'm setting up is, I'm saying this negative 6 plus x divided by 2 is supposed to equal negative 1. And negative 1 plus y divided by 2 has to equal positive 1. Does that make sense? Now, if that makes sense, then let's do the solving. Okay, I'm going to multiply each side by 2 because that gets rid of my fraction. Negative 6 plus x equals negative 2. Add 6, x is 4. And on the second one, same idea, multiply to get rid of the fraction. Multiply by 2, that gets rid of that. Negative 1 plus y equals 2. Add 1, y is 3. So the other endpoint was for thumbs up or down? Brandon? Up or down? Kind of? All right, finding the other endpoint is harder than just finding the midpoint. So you'll need to watch for that problem. I think I've given you like one of those where you're trying to find the missing endpoint. All right, we need to look at another formula. Another formula is the distance formula. The distance formula helps us calculate how far 2 points are apart on an xy axis. Okay, so look at the formula there. To get the distance between your 2 points, one point again is going to be called x1, y1, and the other point is x2, y2. We're going to subtract the x values and square it. We're going to subtract the y values and square it. Add together and in the end square root. Later on in our class we will develop where this formula comes from. Right now, is this a formula you've seen before? Okay, should be from Algebra 1. We're just going to practice calculating with it again. Okay, so on our problem, we're going to try and find the length of FG. Remember, with no symbol up on top, it means the distance between those points or the length of that segment. So we're going to find the length of FG, the length of JK, and then determine whether, what's this say? Whether they're congruent. How do you decide that? Okay, if their distances are equal. Okay, so let's find the length of each one. FG has coordinates of 1, 2, and G has coordinates 5, 5. Let's use those two in the distance formula, figure out how long that segment is. Square it up. I don't care which are the ones and which are the twos. I'm going to go 5 minus 1 squared for the x part, and then the y's in the same order. 5 minus 2 squared. Last thing you'll do is the square root. 5 minus 1 is 4, we have to square it yet. 5 minus 2 is 3, we still have to square it. 4 squared, 16. 3 squared is 9. 16 plus 9 is 25. Square root of 25 is 5. Do I need to do negative 5? No, because the formula doesn't say do the negative square root. Okay? So that segment is 5 units long. Okay, now we need to figure out JK. So what are the coordinates of J and K? J is negative 4, 0. K is negative 1, negative 3. JK's length. Figure out which you want the 1's to be and which you want the 2's to be. I'm going to do x1, y1, x2, y2. So I did negative 1 minus negative 4 squared, negative 3 minus 0 squared. Minus negative 4's plus positives, so that's 3 squared plus negative 3 squared. 3 squared is 9. Negative 3 squared is 9. It's not negative 9. You have 9 and 9, square root of 18. A little bit bigger than 4. 4 times 4 is 16. It'd be a little bit bigger than that. I'm not really going to make you come up with the decimal. That one's not a perfect square. So for right now, I'm just going to say this is the square root of 18. We'll eventually get to reducing those. So determine whether the two segments are congruent. FG was 5. JK was the square root of 18. Are they congruent? No, they're not. Okay? So they are not congruent. Question on that sample. Okay, let's do another one, and I'll give the girls one segment and the guys another one, and then we'll compare those two answers. All right, on this one, why don't we do girls? You do EF. Guys, you do GH. Once you've calculated, you can compare with another person that was doing that same segment, and then we'll compare our two answers to see whether they're congruent or not. Figure out the coordinates for the endpoints of the segment you've been assigned.
He has like 18 immediate jobs. Ridiculous. They need a hobby. About 30 minutes. If it takes you 30 minutes to get out from there,
Okay, guys, let's see, who did I give EF? Girls? Okay, girls, what was EF? 5? Okay, correct. Guys, GH? 5, so they ended up the same? So our answer was congruent, let's make sure that was the right answer. 5 and 5, yes. Question calculating the distance one. I know it's confusing because midpoint has adding the x's and adding the y's. Distance formula has subtracting the x's and subtracting the y's. And eventually we'll go through why that is based on how the formula was created. So be careful on those. The last formula to look at today is the Pythagorean theorem. You know what formula that is?
yes.
A squared plus b squared equals c squared, correct. Okay, a little bit of terminology on your notes. In a right triangle, the legs are the two sides that form the right angle. Okay? They don't have to be horizontal and vertical, just depends which way the triangle's turned. But the two that form the right angle are the legs. The other side, the one that ends up across from the right angle, is the hypotenuse. So don't say the hypotenuse is the slanted one, because depending how it's positioned, it might not be slanted, it might be horizontal, and the legs slant. The Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The a and the b are the legs, the c is the hypotenuse. Now you can use the Pythagorean theorem to do distance instead of the distance formula if you really want to. What you would have to do if you were doing that is take the segment that you're trying to find the length of and form a right triangle, horizontal and vertical. Then you could count to find the height, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could count to find the width, 4, and you could use Pythagorean theorem instead of the distance formula. Now how do we actually finish the Pythagorean theorem? Well, what's 5 squared? 25. 4 squared? 16. When you add together, 41. And then square rooting. Technically, we can have a positive and a negative when we square root. Which one's our distance going to be? The positive. So on this problem, we would have that c is the square root of 41, which is about, what's it in between? It's bigger than square root of 36, but smaller than the square root of 49. What's the square root of 36? 6. Okay, and square root of 49 is 7, so it's somewhere in between there. So maybe I would just guess at the decimal. As far as what we're doing right now, if you get those square roots on your answer, and you will get some, just keep it in the square root form. Okay, don't worry about going to decimal unless the directions say that. And we will eventually get to reduce those, but we haven't covered that yet. Okay, let's do a couple of Pythagorean theorem examples. Often we use Pythagorean theorem on like story type or real life rather than XY axis problems. So draw yourself a picture here. We have the sides of a rectangular TV. They are 30 inches and 42 inches. Rectangles have right angles in the corner. You can't use Pythagorean theorem unless you have a right triangle. So putting the 90 degree. Okay, 30 inches and 42 inches. What's the length of its diagonal? To the nearest tenth of an inch. So if you don't have a calculator, we'll have to help you with that last part. The Pythagorean theorem can be used. 30 should be fairly easy to do on your own. And even 42 times 42. I would agree doing the square root is hard to do. There is a way to calculate square roots, but actually I have never been taught how to do it. I know it has to do with averaging when you're doing the dividing. So I'm not going to expect you to calculate the decimal of the square root. But what do you have to do the square root of? What number? And what's the number part? 2,664? And the answer to that, when you square root, and just the positive one is all we want for the length, 51.6. So if you didn't get your 2,664, then you wouldn't have gotten the right answer in the end. Questions setting up the Pythagorean theorem and working through it. All right, do we need to do multiple examples on Pythagorean theorem? Yep. All right, and as I mentioned, you can do Pythagorean theorem instead of distance formula, but you would have to form a right triangle to do that. All right, your assignment involves those three formulas mainly, and then studying your terminology. We have covered all of the chapter, so tomorrow we'll do some review. I'll probably grab our compass and straight edge again because there were some constructions we did this chapter that might be on your test. We'll do some review items tomorrow. Okay, I have 1 through 4, 6, 7, 11, 21, 28, 36, 37, 48, 50. Study your terms, symbols, and formulas. As you have a quiz tomorrow. I guess I should also put postulates. Postulates would be more of a fill in the blank rather than matching it with its number. So be prepared for a terminology type of quiz. Okay, use your time to either study or start on that assignment. Math.